Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. We have a great show ahead, obviously, recapping last night's big games. Pretty valiant effort by Seattle, my team, against the Detroit Lions, going into Detroit down a couple of defensive players, but alas, to no avail. But the less we say about the Titans-Dolphins game, the better. But we do have to mention that game, unfortunately, as much as it kind of pains me to mention it, because there weren't many big fantasy performances. But then we get into the fun stuff of the week. Start my positional rankings with the QBs and running backs. Take a look around the waiver wire. A lot of interesting players still out there on the open market. And then conclude with my bold fantasy predictions for this coming week. My Don't Be Surprised If segment, if you will, to conclude. Before we get into any of that good stuff, I do want to remind you to like, follow, and subscribe to the show if you do feel so inclined. Also, you guys have been doing a great job of this already, but I'm going to continue to hammer it home. Consider making yourselves available to the Super Chats, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. They're a great way to interact with the show. Get your comments on air, any burning questions, comments, or concerns about fantasy sports, whether it be trade analyses, whether it be team analyses. I love every single comment that comes through this show. So if you feel so inclined throughout the entirety of the show, consider making yourselves available to these three great features. But without further ado, let's jump right in today's show. Let's start off with a fantasy recap. Let's start off with the weaker of the two games, just to get it out of the way. Before we get into it, all I really can say about this game is that it was one of those games where you really had to kind of choke it up and watch, even though you didn't feel like it, right? It was one of those games where, hey, it's a doubleheader. I can tune into the Seattle game later if this game's bad. And that's what it turned out being, right? You know, you kind of checked out of this game midway through it. Maybe even after Will Levis got injured in, the third play of the game, you checked out. But there really isn't much to say outside of the fact that perhaps Mason Rudolph can lead this Titans offense more competently. And for the life of me, I don't know why Mike McDaniel did not utilize Tyler Huntley to the best of his abilities. That's something I said yesterday in my prior episode when I talked about a guy like Tyler Huntley. If he's a dual-threat quarterback, you can open up a lot of avenues in the run game, try and work the short to intermediate areas of the field in the pass game, and try and play mistake-free football, most importantly. But they looked like a college-level, FCS-level offense out there. It did not look pretty for that offense. And it's not going to look pretty if they continue to put their quarterbacks in disadvantageous situations. And so that is kind of telling to me that it might not just be the quarterback situation. It could very well be Mike McDaniel's coaching that's holding this team back. Because now, yes, it sucks that Tua's out, and we know how much you love him and his big playability in the passing game. But you have Tyler Huntley, who's someone who adds a lot of value with his legs, which is something that Tua doesn't bring. So why not bring it in to your offense if Tyler Huntley's the guy going forward? But in terms of fantasy, if there's anything to take away from this game, it's the Titans' run game. Obviously, with Will Levis out there, we're going to lean very heavily on the run game, and it's stepped up, in my honest opinion. Tony Pollard is probably the only fantasy star of the game. 22 carries, 88 yards, 1 touchdown for him, 18.8 fantasy points. And then, make of this what you will, the Titans' defense had a decent game, but of course, the Dolphins' offense was so sloppy that it might not even have mattered. 12 fantasy points, 1 fumble recovery, and 2 sacks in this game for them. So, as you can see, very, very sloppy game overall, but ultimately, one team had to win it, and the Titans had a more convincing run game, surprisingly. Even though, it kind of came about, unfortunately. We do hope for Will Levis' speedy recovery, even though, he might not be the best of quarterbacks. Perhaps, Brian Callahan still thinks something of him and wants to continue to use him as their number one choice. But Mason Rudolph, at the very least, played a very competent part in this game as the QB in last night's game for them. And on the Dolphins side of things, they really blew it. They really blew it, man. I don't know how, if you're a Dolphins fan, you can continue watching this team knowing that Mike McDaniel is probably ruining Tua's absence more than trying to figure out ways to implement exciting elements to this offense with what he has. Because he still has a lot, and I guess I get that you're kind of struggling trying to create big plays, but it's what you have at your quarterback position that could be very exciting if you utilize the best parts of him. So going forward, that's what I want to see out of the Dolphins if they have any consistency. But let's get on to the more exciting game. And yes, as a Seattle fan, the more disappointing result, at least for me. Although, as a Seattle fan, I couldn't be prouder of a loss in recent Seattle Seahawks history than this one. Because you go into Detroit, going up against an NFC Championship game participant from last year, this close to making the Super Bowl. Down 4 of perhaps your best defenders, you lose Julian Love in the midst of the game, and you still hang tough with a Detroit Lions offense that looked like nobody could stop it. This was the get-right game, as Tap to Learn says, feel bad for Tariq. Wouldn't be surprised if they trade him for a slew of picks. I mean, the trade interest would be surprising, because he still adds a lot of value to this team. But, you're right in thinking that perhaps the Tua situation will look a bit more shaky as the year goes forward, because we don't know how he'll look when he gets back, when his timeline to return is back, and most importantly, what his family is thinking if, they are considering his early retirement this season. So I feel like Tyreek is one of those players who you have to find ways to utilize. And yes, there were a lot of plays in which he was going on end arounds in last night's game. They tried to get him going in the run game, but you just have to find a way to work him into this offense if you're Mike McDaniel with what you have at the QB position. You can't make excuses for, we lost the big play, woe is me. Tyreek Hill still has speed. He still has effective route running skills in the middle of the field where Tyler Huntley might be more comfortable passing the football. And, most importantly, he can open up a lot of avenues for the supplementary pieces of this offense. So he is an interesting player when it comes to who to consider leaving at the trade-in line. But at the very end of the day, he still could add a lot of value if Mike McDaniel just sees the best in him throughout the rest of the season and not ruining what Tua could have brought, rather than a guy like Tyler Huntley. But let's get to the Seattle-Detroit game, because that is the more exciting of the two. Let's talk about Detroit. This was the get-right game that they needed, albeit, as Tapson said, he might ask for a trade himself. Well, he might not be as, antsy as Stephon Diggs to leave, Buffalo and go to Houston, but he could ask for it if this is what the Dolphins' offense is going to be for the rest of the year. And that's a disappointing thing because a lot of fantasy owners had high hopes for him this year, but it is what it is. You can't necessarily control when or how Tua gets injured. So I feel bad for the Dolphins, but at the same time, I don't feel bad right now for Mike McDaniel and the place he's put this offense in. But we have to get to the Seattle-Detroit game because both of these teams prove something. For Detroit, it proved how dynamic this offense truly is. Every single facet of this game for them on the offensive side of the football, whether it be the run game, whether it be Amon-Ra through the air, both passing and receiving the ball, so to speak. And Jared Goff, 18 of 18. Perfect game from Jared Goff. 292 yards, 2 TDs, 1 receiving TD through the air, 27.18 fantasy points for him. Sterling performance from him at home in a must-win, kind of a must-win situation for Detroit. It kind of cements them as still one of the premier teams in the NFC. But if you're Seattle, this game proved more about them than it did about Detroit. Because a lot of people thought Seattle could not hang with Detroit. Yes, they were mentioning the defensive struggles. But on offense, they didn't seem to think that this Seattle team would hold up against a very potent run defense and potentially kind of sneaky secondary. But they more than held their own. Let's talk about Geno Smith. Career day for him in terms of pass completions, pass attempts, like I said, and passing yards. 38 of 56, 395 yards, 1 TD, 1 desperation interception, 21.6 fantasy points. Really impressive performance. This one is going to leave him with his head held high because he took Detroit's interior and edge rushers best shots all game, and he delivered one of the better quarterbacking performances of the season, in my opinion, in a losing effort. And he really showed that in the midst of all the offensive struggles, because I think Seattle might have the weakest offensive line of any team in the league, and that's saying something, but I feel like Geno's showing us that he can still be a premier quarterback for this team, and in Ryan Grubb's offense, the sky's the limit for him. If he just takes care of the football, keeps Seattle in games, they can continue to surprise these bigger teams. They're going to face a lot more explosive attacks, and they're might have to play catch-up. As Will Casper, welcome to you in the chat. Trade Mike Evans for Kelsey. I have great wide receiver depth and a Pitts at tight end. I feel like keeping Mike Evans here would be the best situation, because as Kelsey might get more targets in that Chiefs offense, I still feel like the best QB wide receiver duo in the league right now might just be Baker Mayfield and Mike Evans. They're hitting their stride this season, and they're both been paragons of consistency to start the year. And it just goes to show the development of this Bucs offense, even without Dave Canales to control it. And I think that it would be a terrible mistake to try and feel it out with Kelsey, because Kelsey's the older player, and yes, he perhaps is looking like the most appealing weapon in that Chiefs attack right now, but Mike Evans is just a huge, valuable asset for you. And it just proves that if you're saying you have great wide receiver depth, why, risk losing one of your best ones for someone who might not provide as much going forward. So I would say stay put there, have good depth. I trust your intuition, and good luck to you in your fantasy football exploits. But I do want to round this out, because one of the surprising kind of through lines and storylines of this game was the Seattle Seahawks O-line, and most importantly, how it affected the run game. Because the Lions were the most, as Will Casper says, thanks man, appreciate it. I appreciate you, Will. Continue to comment throughout the show if you so feel like it. The most impressive aspect of this game for Seattle, as a Seattle Seahawks fan, was the Seattle O-line. Yes, Aiden Hutchinson affected the game a little bit, but he did not record a sack. His name wasn't called that much. And Stone Forsythe, who is a backup tackle, really held his own. I was really impressed by him. Kudos to him. The ground game is what really surprised me. Kenneth Walker especially surprised me. A hat trick of touchdowns on 80 yards and 12 carries, 33.8 fantasy points. Off an oblique injury, he came back with a vengeance. He really showed how valuable he can be for the Seattle offense. It shows how varied, most importantly, Seattle can be, because DK Metcalf also had a huge game. 7 catches, 104 yards, 15.4 fantasy points. But just supplementary, complementary football is what's going to get this Seattle team to be one of the feistier ones in the NFC. And I think they proved it tonight last night in a valiant effort against the Detroit Lions team that really took advantage of them. This game could have been closer too. Obviously, the DK Metcalf fumble early in the first is a painful one. The potentially missed pass interference call that should have been overturned, the 2-point conversion. I can make all the excuses for Seattle. But even in a loss, I can't look past the fact that they still made a valiant go at it on the road against one of the NFC's best. And for that, as a Seattle fan, I'm forever grateful. They played a fantastic game. I could not have asked more of that offense. And I can't really blame the defense, even though Mike McDonald was trying to piece together a defensive unit that was sound enough to try and attempt to stop this Lions offense. So we have to roll with the punches. We go again next week against New York. But it is a very fascinating game. It was a very fascinating game if you're a fantasy football manager or just a fan of the NFL. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. But coming up next, we're going to be taking a brief look around the league in terms of the waiver wire. It's a huge, huge week for a lot of big players in terms of the open market. We'll be right back after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I
wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we begin with our second segment of today's show, taking a look around the waiver wire, I do want to remind you yet again to like, follow, and subscribe to the podcast and network as a whole. Also check out some of my fellow podcasters as well. They're doing great things with their own shows in their own right, but also continue making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. They're a great way to make this show as interactive as possible. Welcome all newcomers as well. Any burning questions, comments, or concerns for that matter are welcome because I love your opinions as well. Don't want to listen to mine all day. I want to get some fresh opinions as well in the show. So if you so choose, that's a great way to interact with the show. But without further ado, let's get into our second segment of the day. Take a quick look around the waiver wire. A lot of interesting developments here. A lot of injuries impacting how we view the waiver wire as well. And with this list, these are all guys who, for the most part, are stepping up in place of injuries, but also just stepping up in general. Because the waiver wire is a balance of guys who you might have to replace injured players with, or just guys who are having breakout seasons or going under the radar entirely in certain leagues. And that's what I love about it, the start of this season. Because as the season goes on, a lot of everyone's top players will eventually come back. The Cooper Kupps, the Puka Nacuas of the world, the Deebo Samuels of the world will all start coming back. Maybe even the Christian McCaffreys of the world. But that's just wishful thinking. Sorry to dig at all you number one overall pick guys, but I had to. At the end of the day, though, the waiver wire has always been a valuable asset in order for you to supplement your team even further. Because a lot of the questions that I have been getting could also kind of be answered with the waiver wire. It's all dependent on your way of thinking. So without further ado, let's jump right into who I believe going into this week especially will be the biggest guys on the waiver wire. And this guy is kind of a return player or returnee to this section, if you will. And that is graphic Tutu Atwell. What I love about Tutu Atwell is that when I think about the Rams' depth, he's someone who could, on, say, an average team, perhaps like the Bears or maybe even the Panthers if you go down the pecking order a little bit, he would probably be a wide receiver one. He certainly has the traits to. Solid route runner, good vertically, fantastic speed, and replacing, Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua is hard, but he's doing it admirably. 4 catches, 82 yards against Chicago this week, 12.2 fantasy points, and he's someone, along with Jordan Whittington, as a receiver for the Rams, who I kind of think going forward will have a say in at least PPR leagues because they're going to receive a lot of targets. Actually, if you want to think about it this way, Jordan Whittington had just as many receptions as Tutu Atwell, perhaps even more in this game. So that's something looking ahead that could help you in the future if you want to pick up both of them off the waiver wire or just one of them. Tutu Atwell, though, is a guy who potentially could have a couple more big games before the return of both Kupp and Nacua in this offense. And why I trust the Rams to do it so well and try and get him as many touches as possible is because he's one of those players who's highly reminiscent of what Sean McVay can do. Sean McVay has a lot of pre-snap motions. He has a lot of different looks on the offensive side of the ball that can kind of, make this offense more varied than it seems. And what I love about Tutu Atwell is that he ultimately can, in any potential moment, be a game-changing player with just one play. And I feel like that big play ability makes him more coveted than, say, some other guys on here like Whittington and Parkinson. And so going forward, look for Tutu Atwell for as long as he's in to at least have a couple more big games in him. But that's just him for now. Oops, got away from it. But the second player you're all going to love, because seeing this guy play in 2023 was not anyone's bingo card last year, but seeing him play in 2024 was certainly not part of anyone's NFL script. So, without further ado, let's talk about Joe Flacco. Obviously, like I said, no one expected him to step into this role, but of course, Anthony Richardson, kind of an injury-prone player, goes out with a hip injury. What does he do? He did what he kind of did last year with Cleveland. Plays a very solid game. Most importantly, a mistake-free game as well for Indianapolis Colts offense that was very, very boom or bust to start the year, with Anthony Richardson's potential to either throw an interception or make a big play on the field. Most importantly, he got the best out of players like Michael Pittman Jr., who hadn't been performing up to this point. 168 yards for him, 2 touchdowns, 15.2 fantasy points, and he's someone, if he has to start next week, who I might want to look at, because last year a lot of players in fantasy football looked at him when he came into the Cleveland Browns roster because they saw the outlook of the Cleveland Browns team. Obviously, Indy profile, there's a team that's very different from what the Browns were last year, in that all Flacco really had to do was play complimentary football, but most of the time the Colts are inept on the defensive end. So it's all going to come down to, whether or not A, he even starts, and B, if he can continue to get the best out of the best players. And even if it's just for one game, it's still entertaining, right? To think that you could pick up Joe Flacco on the waiver wire as potentially a QB2 for you in a deeper league or a 2 QB league to play a game of fantasy football for you in the year 2024, because no one would have expected it. But yet here we are in the situation where I'm telling you that Joe Flacco is out there on the waiver wire yet again. So if you feel so inclined, pick him up. I'm not stopping you. I think that he could have a big game should he play next week against the Jags. And it's a decent game for him because the Jags are a dumpster fire as well. He can exploit the Jacksonville defense, much like what Andy Dalton is doing to weak defenses with the Panthers. So look out for Joe Flacco out there on the waiver wire. These next two guys are two guys I'm starting to come around to. We get a lot of comments about them here on this show. And the reason why I've kind of been non-committal about these two guys is because I haven't really seen a lot of them. I haven't seen both of their teams as much as I needed to gauge their talents and what they can do in their respective teams. But now that I've seen two of them in a larger sample size, I really like both of them and how they profile in this team. They really aren't just supplementary running backs to the two guys that are ahead of them, but they really are, almost in their own right, players who can develop into RB1s for their team. Let's start off, though, with perhaps the more impressive of the two, or the guy that people are talking about a little bit more than the last guy, Bucky Irving. I love this kid, because I was thinking about Rachaad White. We also had a segment before the season even began about whether or not you should draft a guy like Rachaad White. And I think about the scheme of the Bucs offense. Yes, it's a very pass-heavy scheme. Yes, it's all about Baker being comfortable out of structure. But when they do run the ball, it's kind of one of those run schemes where you kind of want to pick up chunk yards, maybe 6 or 7 yards on early downs, and have Baker really pick apart the defense on shorter downs and later downs as well. And so Bucky Irving is one of those guys who might be a little bit lower in people's pecking orders. Maybe that's why he was lower in my pecking order of running backs that you might pick outside of, say, the first 4 rounds, because, he was considered the more explosive of the two backs. Rachaad White was seen as the tone setter. Bucky Irving was seen as the guy who could occasionally bust a couple of big runs. But no, he has really worked in this Bucs offense as both an explosive back and potentially also as a receiving back, but also as the kind of back that the Bucs want in their system, keeping them on schedule. In this game, he really did keep them on schedule. 4.9 yards per carry, 10 carries, 49 yards, 1 touchdown, 12.5 fantasy points. That's all you can ask of someone who you might consider as a flex or RB2 in your league. And so, while I still want to see more of the Bucs offense, and I have a great opportunity to Thursday night against Atlanta, I think that I've seen enough of Bucky Irving to truly be convinced that he's a very awesome depth piece going forward, especially for a Bucs team that would like to potentially vary the way it attacks opposing defenses going forward, because they're going to have a tough stretch of games, and they're going to need to find ways to utilize every single weapon they can outside of, the usual suspects, and Bucky Irving could play a big role in trying to keep them in as many of those tough games down the stretch as possible. And the next guy, this guy is more out of circumstance, if anything, because of how bad his team is as a whole. But Tank Bigsby of the Jacksonville Jaguars has truly been a kind of bright spot for them. So kind of replacing Travis Etienne, really, in terms of his production as well. 7 carries, 90 yards, only 9 fantasy points because he did not find the end zone. But as a whole, I've really been impressed by Tank Bigsby because he's a workhorse back who kind of is one of those guys who's meant to keep this offense on schedule. That being said, if there is one caveat, it's the fact that Doug Peterson still trusts Trevor Lawrence on early downs to be able to make short to intermediate throws that will get them ahead of the sticks, and I don't like that aspect of their offense. I would like to see more Tank Bigsby or even Travis Etienne on earlier downs for the Jacksonville Jaguars to have any kind of momentum on the offensive side of the ball. We saw it a little bit in this game. It wasn't enough in this game against Houston, but in the future, if they want to get back into at least the playoff picture, if not, just relative decency as a football team, they need to continue feeding the rock to their backs and trying to keep them ahead of schedule so as not to put too much pressure on Trevor Lawrence's deep ball to kind of get them out of the holes. But it just goes to show that you kind of have to take your kind of preseason predictions on the chin if you feel like you got them wrong, because you never really know about some of these players coming into different schemes, because at the end of the day, sometimes seasons go wrong. Sometimes injuries pile up quicker than you expect. And this year has proven to be no different. And you have to adapt. And these guys are all adaptable guys. Maybe not Joe Flacco because he might only start one game. But it's still fun to consider him as a waiver wire option. But at the end of the day, the 3 guys outside of him will have value. Even Tutu Atwell might have value when Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua come back. But at the end of the day, it's all about how you interpret it and how you feel like you can supplement your team better. Let me know what you think in the comments. Coming up next, I begin my positional rankings, starting off with the QB position, looking ahead to Week 5, and the top 4 guys I think will have the biggest games in that Week 5 slate. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about that.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, our third segment of the day here. Like I said before the break, we are starting our positional rankings, my personal positional rankings, looking ahead to Week 5, starting off with the QB position. These top 4 guys that I think will have the biggest games of the weekend in terms of a fantasy perspective in Week 5. And all 4 of these guys kind of have a different story to tell, right? Because there are 2 guys here that nobody really predicted. Maybe a couple people predicted, but not many, to have a good year. And the other 2 are guys who have really had interesting topsy-turvy starts to the year, but I think down the stretch will be proven to be as good as ever for you at the fantasy position. There's no necessarily surprises in this list, I would say. Maybe you'll be shocked at the last one I mentioned, but overall I think it's a comprehensive list looking ahead to week 5. Remember, before I watch any of the games, these are my rankings before I watch that week's games. These are not, with the knowledge of what I saw from week 4. So you could disagree with me, and I might want to counteract myself at certain points in this segment, but I'm sticking with this list because I think that I'm confident in saying these guys will step up. Without further ado, let's get right into this list right here. Starting off with a guy who had a fantastic performance against one of the better teams in the AFC, Lamar Jackson, going up against a divisional opponent in the Cincinnati Bengals, who picked up their first win, but not in convincing fashion, against the Carolina Panthers team that I feel like they should have beaten more comprehensively, even with the kind of rejuvenation of Andy Dalton in that team. So, that being said, I think Lamar Jackson will continue from what we saw of him this week against Buffalo, perhaps one of the better quarterbacking performances we've seen all season, at least in terms of dual threat ability. Now, the thing I like about Lamar Jackson is that if Derrick Henry continues having big performances, I still am a little bit skeptical about him in that offense. I appreciate his past 2 games being 2 of the best games of his career, especially at the age of 30, but I want to see him sustain this success throughout the season because I still liked the Gus Edwards, J.K. Dobbins committee approach when they were healthy. They were really fun to watch. Well, with them, Lamar, and other pieces in that offense, and it opened up a lot for them. But if this offense continues the way it's been looking for the past 2 weeks, then I see no reason as to why Lamar Jackson can consistently be one of the better fantasy QBs. Derrick Henry can consistently be one of the better fantasy running backs, and overall, the Ravens being one of the better teams in the entire NFL. Lamar had 23.64 fantasy points last week, only 156 yards passing for 2 touchdowns, but he got a lot of yards on the ground as well, as we all know. And he probably is right now the best dual threat option at the QB position. So he's a no-brainer week in, week out, depending on the matchup a little bit. But going forward, as he heads into divisional play, trying to get the Ravens to the top of the division, I think that he will be able to. And just looking at their comprehensive victory over a Buffalo Bills team who a lot of people might have been crowning as a Super Bowl contender after their consistent performances, it really goes to show that Lamar, at least in the regular season, still has staying power in the AFC, despite the fact that he's losing, some of what the defense did for him last year in terms of bolstering him on the offensive side of the football and bolstering his exploits on that side of the football as well. And also, he doesn't necessarily have to worry too much about the pass game because Derrick Henry seems to have gotten it covered over the past 2 weeks. So Lamar Jackson is someone who is looking very relaxed, looking very composed in this new look Ravens offense, and I think he will continue to shine. Then another guy who you might, criticize me for, I'll take the flack for it, but I kind of feel like with the narrative surrounding this team and surrounding him to start the season, I kind of feel like this is the perfect game for them to take stock of themselves. It's a Monday night game at home. Yes, you're kind of reeling a little bit, but you're going to take stock of yourselves, and that's Pat Mahomes. Yes, I mentioned that he himself is stating that he has not been up to par this season for his team. And obviously, you can point to all the injuries. We don't know the timeline of when Hollywood Brown could return. Isaiah Pacheco's out for at least the next 4 to 5 weeks. Rashee Rice is probably out for the entirety of the year. So that means you're relying on Kareem Hunt in the ground game to some extent with maybe a combination of Samuel J. Pirine, Xavier Worthy, who, as much as I love him and I love his speed, he is more of a gadget play guy, and Travis Kelce, who finally had a pretty good game against LA, but is 35 and can't be expected to be the number 1 target getter in this team. So it certainly feels like this game could be another sloppy one for them. But, like I said, if you just take stock of where the Chiefs are, you look at how they've gotten to 4-0, they just continue to win in so many different ways. Yes, you can say that some of it might be, from a little help from their friends and stripes, but I think that at the end of the day, they just have a certain magic to them. No matter what, you always can count on Patrick Mahomes having a play or two that could change the trajectory of the game. You can always count on him trying to get Travis Kelce going. And yes, this offense is in weird territories now after, the loss of Rashee Rice, because they don't have a number one receiver, much like where they were last year when they didn't know what they had in guys like Rice and others. But right now, this feels like a game where you could potentially be sleeping on the fantasy potential of Patrick Mahomes. And not for nothing, the Saints really haven't been impressive. They've truly declined over the past 2 weeks, especially on the defensive side of the ball. They're struggling with injuries. So look for Patrick Mahomes to have a solid game. He might be a little bit frustrated early on, but look for him to grow into the game as he's becoming more comfortable, with rolling with the punches. And that's something that the Chiefs will have to do if they want to win their third consecutive Super Bowl. Roll with the punches. And it's something that they've done consistently thus far to get to this point. So Pat Mahomes could be an interesting play for this upcoming week. Then a guy who I think will continue to have a big game, continue to have his bright star shine through this NFL season is Baker Mayfield. My fantasy star of the week yesterday. If you didn't watch that segment, go ahead and watch it because I sung his praises and I will continue to sing his praises for as long as he looks good in this new look Bucs offense with Liam Cohen at the helm after the Dave Canales era there. Going up against an Atlanta Falcons team that I don't really know if I can say anything about through these past 4 weeks. I don't know how to view them because they have 2 wins, right? They came on impressive game-winning drives, but the offense hasn't really impressed me. They won that game against New Orleans without scoring an offensive touchdown. And right now, Bijan Robinson doesn't look effective. Drake London, yes, he's had nice touchdown catches. And, Kirk Cousins has at least looked competent enough to lead this offense following, a shaky first game where it looked like he was still, pressured to look good after the Achilles injury last year. But right now, this Falcons team seems in a little bit more disarray than where this Bucs team is. And Baker Mayfield is playing the best football he's ever played in his career. 347 yards, 2 touchdowns, 28.88 fantasy points. And as long as, the connection between him and Mike Evans develops, because last year, there was not that much trust in what he had, even though he was very impressive last year. You could see the change from this year to compared to last year where, he didn't necessarily, trust, like I said, as much Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. Now it seems like he's gained their trust, they've gained his trust, and so I feel like going forward, this team will be very exciting on the offensive side of the ball, and Baker Mayfield will be a huge integral part of that. But the last guy I kind of want to mention is a guy who a couple of weeks ago people would be condemning me for putting him on this list. But he's proven that this team that he's building, the team that's surrounding him, can be impressive for at least a couple more weeks and have staying power in a NFC East division that really has no rhyme or reason to it, and it's Jaden Daniels. Impressive to say the least completion percentage, 82.1% completion percentage. I think that for the past 4 games, the only other quarterback who's had as high a completion percentage as him, at least in the rookie perhaps, is Peyton Manning. That's rarefied company for a guy of Jaden Daniels' stature. We all knew that, he would probably be good for the Washington Commanders in that Cliff Kingsbury style offense, but we didn't know he would be this good. And you can say the claim that, Cliff Kingsbury offenses usually peter out down the stretch, but he's been out of football for a little bit. He's been self-scouting himself, and I think he's going to look beyond, utilizing Jaden Daniels' strengths and start to get serious about, finding ways to win against superior competition, because that's what the Commanders are going to have to do. Against the Browns, it's going to be all right because the Browns are a dumpster fire as well. Their defense does not look good enough to sustain them like last year, and the offense, the less we say about them, the better. But so, look for Jaden Daniels to really exploit and continue to exploit inferior opposition, and we'll see the story when he goes up against, the Cowboys and the Eagles, the top 2 competitors in the NFC East. see what the story is there. But for now, against teams like the Browns, expect him to be a huge part of what this Commanders offense is looking like going forward. And I commend him, for being one of the higher completion percentage quarterbacks, because it's very difficult to do as a rookie, learning an offense like that, even though it's one of the more comfortable offenses you can run for a rookie quarterback like Jaden Daniels, who, works in a college-style offense. I'm sorry, he just does. And I think that, going forward, it is something to monitor, but let's just enjoy him and appreciate him while we can, because this is kind of, in a way, reminiscent of what Stroud was doing last year, except, this Commanders team certainly feels like it doesn't have that much longevity, right? Because when I think about it, the Houston Texans of last year with C.J. Stroud had an identity that DeMeco Ryans immediately instilled. I don't know if, Dan Quinn can instill enough identity in both sides of the football to really make them have staying power, but I want to be proven wrong, because from what I see of them, the Commanders are going to be a very intriguing team to watch going forward that could compete in the NFC East. But let me know what you think in the comments. Coming up next on our show, we transition from the QE position to the running back position. A lot of interesting stories there to talk about heading into Week 5 in my personal rankings. You definitely don't want to miss it. We'll be right back after this short break, so don't go anywhere.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. Like I said before the break, our fourth segment will be focused on the running back position. We started our positional rankings for the week with the QB position. Hope you like that segment. Let me know what you think about that segment in the comments as well if you have any questions about it. But looking ahead to the running backs, definitely a lot of interesting guys. The 4 guys I picked this week kind of are guys who either have stepped up, I want to see step up based off of what I've seen out of their offenses so far, or just guys who I feel like will be more consistent going forward. Guys who will have been around, the periphery of solid, high-end running backs in fantasy, but are looking to break out for their offenses and for you in terms of fantasy. Without further ado, let's jump right into our fourth segment of the day here. Let's start off with a running back who really has been a nice supplementary piece for this Indianapolis Colts offense in the past couple of weeks. Especially, with the uncertainty about how injury-prone Anthony Richardson really is and how that will affect his development. This guy really does need to step up, but has proven and answered the call, at least in the past 2 weeks, that he can have staying power in this Colts offense. And that is... I did not make a graphic for that. I'm sorry. Jonathan Taylor. I thought I made a graphic. Sorry for that. Excuse me for that. But we will do this segment without graphic anyways, because I think that it will still be a good one that you can comment on if you so choose throughout. Jonathan Taylor, like I said, is a guy who is going to be, at the very least, a high-end RB1 for you in offense, if not an RB2, should they want to develop Anthony Richardson more. And that's a thing that you have to kind of monitor, right? Because as much as we want to see Anthony Richardson succeed in the league, it's not to his detriment, right? We don't want to see him continuously get injured in this offense. And so what do you need besides, a guy like Anthony Richardson to develop? You need a solid running back in the backfield. And that's what Jonathan Taylor, at least for the past 2 weeks, has shown. 21 carries, 88 yards, 1 touchdown, 19.8 fantasy points against the Steelers' run defense, mind you. Was looking to be one of the more impressive in the league. Really gashed them, especially, after Richardson went down. And he's going up against a Jags defense that, the less we say about the better, whether it be the run defense or the pass defense, albeit, holding the Texans at 24 points being impressive, I still don't think going forward that they have as much of a shot on the defense as people think. So look for him, whether it be, Anthony Richardson or Joe Flacco at the QB position, to really supplement both of them very nicely. Because that's what I wanted to see out of him to begin with to start the season. A nice complementary style of play at the running back position that allows Anthony Richardson to develop and allows him to stay on schedule. So, as long as Anthony Richardson is healthy, that partnership is going to continue to grow, and that's why I appreciate Jonathan Taylor as not only a real-life running back, but a fantasy running back. But this next guy that I'm going to talk about, as we've had a love-hate relationship with him here on the show, before the start of the season, in fact, I kind of said that this guy was not going to replicate his exploits of last year, because of his speed and how this offense was looking projected for the season. And now that we know we're 4 weeks into the season, his quarterback is hurt, and they have to come up with different plays to kind of keep that offense on schedule. I kind of want him to be the focal point of this offense now. I'm kind of retracting what I said about him to start the year and kind of wanting to go all in on him. It's through kind of fate of circumstance, but I feel like going forward, his fantasy value could only skyrocket from here, hopefully. And that's De'Von Achane. What I liked about what bringing Tyler Huntley into the team would do for the Dolphins was it would allow De'Von Achane to have a bigger role, because I thought with Tua, he was kind of holding him back because, yes, De'Von Achane was good for an explosive play on the ground, but ultimately what Mike McDaniel wants, I believe, is Tua to be very effective in the vertical game down the field. So that's why I felt like De'Von Achane might be a little bit inhibited in terms of what he was able to do in this offense this year. But now that that's not the case anymore, now that you have Tyler Huntley, and this is more of an imploring kind of statement to Mike McDaniel, if he sees this segment at all, I don't think he will, but I'm still imploring him to utilize both Huntley and Achane to great effect. It opens up a lot more avenues. Trust me, I know it's painful, letting go of what you had wanted to build your offense around this year and kind of throwing it all out the window to go more run heavy and kind of eschewing Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. But it's what you have to do. And I think what is going to be most effective, most importantly, going forward for you to stay competitive if that's what you want this season. Because I feel like the Dolphins aren't that, good in terms of depth, but they still have talent, right, that you can utilize. So you can't necessarily pack it in if you're Mike McDaniel and the Dolphins organization this year, because you have weapons to be good. And you're going up against the Patriots. It's a divisional game that you can very easily win. And it's going to come down to, I think, in this game, being effective in the run game, because the Patriots aren't that good at setting the edge. You have a guy in Tyler Huntley who can run the option at the QB position pretty competently. So go with that game plan, because it works against this opponent. Most importantly, it's a divisional game that you can win. It's a very winnable game going forward. It will kind of calm you down and kind of see what your offense is at that point of the season. And most importantly, it will allow De'Von Achane to find his sea legs. And that's why I think I have to retract my statement on him, because through no fault of his own and through no fault of my own, actually, De'Von Achane is going to become an integral part of what the Dolphins do moving forward. So take this with a grain of salt, because I still don't believe Mike McDaniel will do it, but looking forward, I feel like it's something that I want to monitor for them, and I feel like you should as well, because De'Von Achane, when he's on, is perhaps one of the best running backs in fantasy we've seen. And so, make of this what you will, because I still am wary of him. But I'm willing to take the brakes off what I said before the season. What the Dolphins' offense looks like right now. Then our third guy is a guy we've talked about a lot on the show. A lot of you guys like him in the comments. James Conner. I love James Conner. And in order for, Arizona to have the occasional big offensive game where they explode for 30, 40 plus points, it's going to have to come down to the balance between what Kyler Murray brings in the pass game and what James Conner does on the ground. In this game against, I guess the Cardinals, the Commanders, they didn't necessarily have the tools to keep up with them. They were wiped out their home field. It was mainly due to the defense. I think, the offense will occasionally, kind of misfire, but for the most part, they can stay on schedule because of all the talent they now have. And James Conner is a big part of that. They're going up against the 49ers, a vulnerable 49ers team, mind you. And I will mention this game later in the week as one of the friskier games to look out for in terms of big fantasy implications. And I think, one of the things they can exploit is the fact that, the 49ers are losing a lot of depth up front, or they're not playing at full strength up front, and it's showing in how teams play them, right? Get chunk yardage and early downs on third downs, where one of the worst defenses in the league, exploit them in the pass game. And that's what I think the Cardinals' offense should look like. Run, shot play. And I think that will work for them as well because Kyler Murray's arm strength and talent at the QB position is undeniable. And he has weapons in Marvin Harrison, Michael Wilson kind of rounding into his own, Greg Torch, a nice supplementary piece at the wide receiver 3, and most importantly, Trey McBride, who is one of the more physically imposing tight ends in the league, to really help supplement that. So James Conner is going to be a huge X factor in this game if they want to take advantage of a defense like 49ers where they're weaker in the run game and you can exploit them in later downs because they're not good on third down defense as well. So I'm not saying that we'll see offensive fireworks from the Arizona Cardinals in this game, but we'll see a huge game in terms of touches, in terms of targets potentially for James Conner in this one as well. And the last play I want to talk about, kind of a workhorse back, finding his sea legs again. Really impressive game against Minnesota. They kind of went under the radar because of the way they had lost. Josh Jacobs. Yeah, he didn't have many yards in this game against Minnesota. Yeah, it was all more about, seeing how Jordan Love looked like coming back from the MCL injury. But Josh Jacobs is still going to be effective. I think that he's a very, very intriguing part of this Packers offense. Yes, perhaps because of the Christian Watson injury, he's going to get a couple more touches, kind of calm Jordan Love down. Make sure they're playing mistake-free football because what we saw against Minnesota was not indicative of what I think this offense can play like. So, if Josh Jacobs, gets, say, 15 to 20 amount of touches, I think he can make the most of them. Most importantly, in the receiving game, he looked very effective. They said that he had never caught a receiving touchdown in his career, and that's kind of one of those things where you're like, oh, really? Because Josh Jacobs is a very versatile back. And in this Packers offense, suddenly become more versatile, if the passing game suddenly becomes stagnant. And as much as I would love to see the Packers run game, the pass game actually really open up because Jordan Love has a lot of different weapons at his disposal, I think that Josh Jacobs can set the tone for them. They're going up against a Rams team that on the defensive side of the football is not putting all the depth and experience they have together combined with their youngsters, combined with their second, third year players to the best of their abilities. I think that it's going to take a while for their run defense to really coalesce, and I think the Packers should take advantage of that. So look for Josh Jacobs to get a lot of touches in this offense as well. But overall, these four running backs all kind of still have some points to prove to me, whether or not it be their coaches implementing them more into their game style or just, continuing to prove that they're nice pieces for their QBs in the backfield. But let me know what you think in the comments because my list certainly is one that can be scrutinized very heavily. But coming up for our last time of the day's show, I give you my bold fantasy predictions for this coming up week. Don't be surprised if you will, kind of segment that a lot of you guys love. I'll be right back, so don't go anywhere to conclude the show. Hello everyone and welcome back. Last night, as Andre entered the chat to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, as Andre says, what a game last night. Gino was so locked in. Yeah, I agree. I agree that Gino was very locked in last night. He made all the throws he had to, but it ultimately ended up being a losing effort against, a Detroit Lions team that looked pretty unstoppable. But kudos to Gino for hanging tough. 56 passes is a lot, man. As Andre said, I'm pretty sure all the props you posted hit too, right? I think that a lot of them did hit, except for the one where I said you should sit Kenneth Walker in fantasy. That was a bad mistake on my part. I did not expect him to have as big a game as he had last night, but he proved me wrong because I was kind of worried going into this game how Seattle was going to look in the run game because of how potent we know the Lions' run defense is, but he really proved me wrong. As Andre said, the D-line couldn't do anything. Yeah, man. It really was one of those games where you kind of had to bank on the offense scoring every drive. And, if it weren't for that DK hit or DK fumble early in the game, I think that, as Andre continues raving about this game, I agree. Amon-Ra's under hit what a call. Witherspoon is so good. To both of those points, Amon-Ra's under hit kind of, one of those predictions where I kind of went against my will because he's on my fantasy team. But it's one of those things where I kind of felt like this offense for, as Andre also says, 3 touchdowns for K9 sitting on my bench. You got to roll with the punches sometimes in fantasy. But the Witherspoon point, I love Witherspoon too. He's developing still. That's the most impressive thing about him. And, it wasn't entirely the secondary's fault either. It was kind of the fact that the D-line couldn't do anything. The Lions' superior offensive line really imposed their will on that depleted Seahawks D-line, so you have to roll with it. But as long as we can get some players back, it proves that we can have staying power against some of the more tough teams on our schedule. But thank you for all your comments. It was a truly great game, even if, as a Seattle fan, it was a painful one to watch and live with. But to conclude today's show, we want to get into our bold fantasy predictions for Week 5, or Don't Be Surprised If segment, if you will, to conclude today's show. And I have a lot of interesting takes. You are free to comment about them, whether it be criticism or praise for this list. I try to make them as varied as possible, try to make them as wild as possible in terms of the potential of how they can play out. But ultimately, this is a list that you can either, take with a grain of salt or kind of take as gospel if you like. Without further ado, let's jump right into our final segment of the day here. Starting off with a game that has 2 of the better quarterbacks in the league in it, but the way I see it going might not be what you expect. And that is CJ Stroud and Josh Allen disappointing in fantasy. As Andre said, Laporta did something for once too, haha. I actually did not think that, Laporta had that big of an effect on the game. He had some nice timely catches, but I was really impressed, if you want to talk about the Lions offense, Jared Goff. I was just impressed that he was able to pitch a perfect game. He only threw 18 passes, yes, so it wasn't that, he was throwing as many passes as Gino trying to escape pressure, but he kept this offense on rhythm, on schedule, and he perfectly supplemented the run game because that's what they were able to stick with. As you know, they just overwhelmed and imposed their will on Seattle. So talk about, quarterbacking performances that were perfectly representative of what they wanted to see out of him in Detroit from Jared Goff. But speaking of quarterbacks, CJ Stroud and Josh Allen, certainly 2 of the better ones in the league. But I think that this game is going to be disappointing on so many different fronts for both of them. They're coming off 2 kind of weak performances, especially Josh Allen in a game where he commits his first turnover of the year. And CJ Stroud, kind of has been disappointing all year. I mean, he's not putting up the lofty stats that he did last year. It might be indicative of some kind of deeper tension there. As Andre said, yeah, bro, it pains me to say as a Packers fan that the Lions are in the North now. I don't know. I would love to see a Lions-Vikings game, and the Packers, despite all the turnovers that Jordan Love committed, still hung tough with the Vikings. And if a few, bounces go their way, you could say they end up winning this game. 2 missed field goals by Narveson, very tough to stomach if you're a Packers fan as well. So who knows? I think that division is certainly going to become more interesting on the stretch as we learn more about Minnesota. I think that for now they're real because they have 2 of the more impressive wins in the league. But, the Lions I still have hope for. They had their best offensive performance of the season. I would like to see it against a better defense. The Packers, with Jordan Love, are still going to have a say. But, it's going to be an interesting divisional race. And it's one that I'm really excited to see play out because I think you can say that 3 teams from that division could easily make the playoffs this year, to a lot of different teams' detriments. But speaking of CJ Stroud and Josh Allen, I feel like in fantasy implications, this game will not have as many offensive fireworks. I look at both of these defenses, they're definitely average at best in terms of how they can effectively stop teams, but they can stay on schedule. They can be opportunistic. They can get takeaways for their team, put their offenses in advantageous situations. And I think this is going to be a game of more, field position than, offensive fireworks. I think it's going to be like one of those gamesmanship games where both coaches are trying to out-scheme the other on both sides of the football. So it's going to be a weird one, but I think at the end of the day, both of these guys are going to have pretty disappointing performances to go off of 2 disappointing performances from this week. Then Baker Mayfield. I continue to sing his praises all week. I'll continue to sing his praises until he puts up a stinker game. Baker Mayfield against Atlanta will have a 300-yard, 3-touchdown performance. Not many this season. Andy Dalton had the first. Who would have thought that this season? But passing is down, But Baker Mayfield's stock is continuing to ascend, though. And against a divisional opponent in what could be a gritty game, as Andre said, the Lions are almost impossible to stop if you can't stop the run. I completely agree, man. I completely agree because David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs are 2 very physical backs. They might be the 2 most physical backs in the entire league because David Montgomery, his style of play is just he's going to smash you in the mouth. And he's not going to like it. As Andre said, he'll shoot 300 for Baker this Thursday. That's my prediction. I love Baker, man. As Andre's saying, is Bijan going to have a good game? I hope so, because what I see out of him this season is that he's getting the touches that Morris promised him, right? But he hasn't been doing much with them. And when Algier comes into the game, he, for some reason, plays better. And the offensive line also blocks better for Algier than they do for Bijan. So I can't really say week by week how Bijan's going to look. I hope and pray that, Bijan has a say in this offense because he is a very skilled player. And I'm not just saying that as someone who watched him at Texas as a big fan of him. I'm saying that as a fan of him in the NFL because I hope that Raheem Morris can utilize him to the best of his abilities because he might just be the most explosive player in that entire offense. But going back to the Baker Mayfield point, I think Baker Mayfield is someone who just can be one of the better quarterbacks in this league right now. It's a league where, quarterbacking play isn't as up as it's been in past years. And it's been tough for QBs to consistently put up big stat lines. But Baker has quietly been putting up big stat lines week in, week out this season. And he's finding his connection with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin easier than last year. Liam Cohen is like the baby Dave Canales in this offensive system. And I just think that the Bucs are going to be a team that, yes, have one of the more difficult stretches in the NFC of any team, but have the offense to hang tough with anyone. And they just beat up the Eagles. Their win over the Commanders is looking impressive. Their win over Detroit is looking more impressive. So who's to say this team can't be a staying power in the NFC this year, especially in an NFC South that could be a weird, wacky division yet again. So Baker, expect him to go off this week against an Atlanta team that I really can't believe in just yet. My next one, the Commanders' defense is going to impress this week. And I actually need to look who they're playing. Sorry, guys, because I completely forgot about it. They are playing someone who I think that they will beat up on. I think that it's the Panthers, but I could be wrong here. But the reason why I think the Commanders' defense will impress is because, not for nothing, Dan Quinn is a defensive-minded coach. And when I see the Commanders' defense and I see some of the players that it has the potential to be a defense that grows into the season and matures into the season. You have a guy in Bobby Wagner who can be an emotional leader for this team. They're actually playing the Browns this week, so it's about the same as the Panthers, at least on the offensive side of the ball. I said it. The Browns are good this year, guys. I don't know what to tell you. But the Commanders' defense, I just feel like I said, they're going to mature as the season goes on. Bobby Wagner's an emotional leader. Frankie Louvu is a very underrated off-ball linebacker. And the secondary has a couple pieces that I like. St. Just, Forbes, even though he's one of the smaller ones in the league, corners in the league, he's going to be someone who I think that is going to really be someone who can set the bar for them. And as much as, this prediction could come back to hit me in the face, because I also think the Commanders have the potential to kind of crumble if, the Cliff Kingsbury kind of sentiment continues. I still think, for at least 1 week, we can appreciate what kind of players the Commanders have on the defensive side of the football. And it's an easy game, too, against Cleveland for them to kind of prove me right. But my last prediction of the day, kind of looking a little bit worse after what happened in that game against Indy. Justin Fields being a surprise top 5 fantasy QB this week. This was more after what we saw of him 2 weeks ago. But, I'm still sticking by this prediction because Justin Fields has certainly been more impressive than what anyone thought coming into the season through 4 weeks than, the average QB in the league starting for Pittsburgh. And also, not for nothing, he wasn't expected to be anyway, so that makes it even more better for the Steelers. I need to check as well who they're playing because I'm forgetting the schedule. They're playing the Cowboys Sunday night, of course. That's going to be an interesting game because the Cowboys, very banged up team. I think Micah Parsons could be out in this game, could be wrong because the injury certainly looked like it was worse than people expected, but it didn't necessarily look bad enough to hold him out for an entire week. But that defense still has not been impressive. And I feel like Justin Fields can take advantage of this defense both through the air and with his legs. So look for Justin Fields. Maybe not a top 5 fantasy QB this week. I might retract from this prediction a little bit. But potentially a top 10 one. And it's a tall task for him. As Andre said, Cowboys in trouble. Yeah, they're definitely looking very desperate. I think that now is the time of any for Mike McCarthy to try and vary this offense to get it outside of the limitations of Dak and CD and try and open it up. But if he's going to be and continue to be insistent in what he's saying in terms of their offensive philosophy, then I don't see how this team can improve that much. But on the other side of the football, the Steelers can take advantage of this Cowboys team that certainly looks a little bit rough to start the year. So that's a fantastic point, Andre. But unfortunately, that will be the end of today's show. Thank you all for watching. As Andre, I'll take this last comment from him off topic, but has JSN taken over as a wide receiver too? He looked great last night. It certainly looked that way. Especially on that 4th down play, where Tyler Lockett, whether you believe it was a penalty or not, was blocking in that situation to get JSN open. So it certainly feels like JSN is taking big steps in this offense. I would love to see him continue to ascend because he's someone who, like I said, if Tyler Lockett leaves, is looking to be someone who could step up. But I was also impressed by a lot of other supplementary pieces as well. For example, Jake Bobo stepping up. A.J. Barner, the rookie tight end, stepping up. A lot of tight end sets that Seattle likes to utilize. Noah Fant as well. Pharaoh Brown stepping up, taking a couple of penalties. Let's go to show that, Seattle has a lot of players on the offense that they can trust. And their depth is impressive. But thank you for all your comments. That will just about do it for today's show. Thank you for all tuning in. Thank you for leaving great comments. Continue making yourselves available to that. Like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network if you so choose. But this has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you. We'll be back 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow, same as always, with another great show. But other than that, I am out. Thank you all for tuning in.